So if you were to use all the money available in Canada to pay back this debt, there still would not be enough. Rents are reversing. The population growth has absolutely tanked compared to what it was. So now you look at the situation and you're like, yeah, this ain't gonna go well. This is not gonna go well here. Each Canadian owns $1.31 in mortgage debt to every dollar of income that is earned. That is how insane. And the big picture view is it's $1.75 that people owe per dollar of earned income if you take into account all debts, not just mortgage debt. So this just shows the insane housing bubble that is going on in Canada when it accounts for this much of debt. Canada's household debt crisis, when and how we outpace Britain and the US. Interesting article. I've seen this kind of go viral on X, which I found very interesting, but there's some good stats in here. So of the roughly $3 trillion in Canadian household debt in the first quarter, nearly 75% of it is tied to mortgages. And that's how I calculated how much debt people owe per person, was using these stats. So between 2000 and 2010, Canada's household debt to GDP ratio was lower than those of Britain and the US, but since 2011 it has surpassed both and the gap has continued to widen. And basically this chart has been making the rounds on X for obvious reasons. It just shows how big and insane the housing bubble is in Canada, and many of you will already know that I've been pointing this out for years. I have been using the Trading Economics debt to GDP ratio, comparing that to that of the US and showing what basically happened. And you can see obviously the peak here as well, which is very, very interesting. And I think that is of most note here. And then you've also got this systemic risk that people don't understand, which will affect the banking system. Bank sale listings are up 4% last month and 120% from June 2024. Wait until pandemic mortgage renewals are in full swing in the second half of this year. So again, this is just likely to accelerate more and more and become a systemic problem to the banking system. Canadians' household debt burden rises slightly in the first quarter. The agency says the ratio of household credit market debt to disposable income rose to 173.9 on a seasonally adjusted basis, up from 173.5% in the fourth quarter of 2024. In other words, StatsCan says that there was $1.74 in credit market debt for every dollar of household disposable income in the first quarter. So you've just got to think about that. And that's how I calculated the mortgage debt, because of that over $3 trillion in debt. You know that 75% of it is mortgage debt. So you know 75% of this $1.74 is mortgage debt, which roughly works out to what I've put on this post here, which is $1.31 for every dollar of income. I mean, that's just absolutely unsustainable. It's a housing bubble, but people have refused to call it. They refused to call it in 2020, 2021, 2022. The only people and the only person that I know that has called it the whole time was Hilliard, and he was very early to the game, but he was in fact very correct, and he couldn't have anticipated obviously what happened during the pandemic as well, with all the money printing that went on there. And then the US housing market is falling apart as well, which I think is interesting. You're seeing housing markets in the UK, housing markets in the US, they're all starting to fall apart now as the global economy goes into recession. Of course, Canada has been in a recession now since 2022. 3 years that Canada has been in this silent depression, and now the unemployment train is really starting to rise and rise and rise, and it will just be skyrocketing towards the end of this year, I believe, because it is just on a terrible trajectory, unfortunately. And you can see what's happening in the job market. So it's really not good what is going on there. And basically, if you want to see what this looks like on a chart, you know, some people pin the bubble to starting around 2008, but I say no, it was around 2004, because that's when that you saw mortgage debt and household debt that just took off from the normal trajectory here and went into bubble territory. So it's absolutely crazy what has happened, but the amount of debt that is in the Canadian banking system is insane. It's over $3 trillion. It's more than the money supply in Canada. So if you were to use all the money available in Canada to pay back this debt, there still would not be enough. So that goes to show just how unsustainable this is unless new debt is created. And what we're starting to see is, of course, that isn't happening either. Nobody is buying new condos in Toronto. Nobody. And this chart has again gone very viral on X, and it basically shows the amount of months of supply of pre-construction condominium apartments. I mean, this is a very scary chart because the banks, they lent all this money out to developers to fund these projects, and they're not going to be able to sell them. They're not going to be able to complete. This is exactly why the banks came forward and said, hey, we're going to do this blanket appraisal thing. It's because they know that if they don't do that, then they're going bust. They're going to have serious problems here. But even that is really just trying to plug the hole with a cork on a boat. It's not going to work long term. And the thing is, you're just noticing more and more issues as the unemployment rate skyrockets, as people don't pay their debts back, that are going to arise, unfortunately. And it's only for so long that these banks can hide all these losses and try and sell the hot potato and pass the hot potato on to other investors and banks and financial institutions. And then this is another story here, which is very interesting because it shows the situation that a lot of people are in with these pre-construction condos. A young buyer was lured into a pre-construction condo by a smooth-talking agent. Now the build is finishing early, but the buyer is broke. The market tanked and their job situation has changed. They can't close, they can't sell, they can't qualify. This is how real estate eats people alive. Long story short, I bought a pre-construction condo a couple of years ago and dutifully started saving for my down payment. Real estate agent was really cagey on a lot of details, pushed me into pricier home options and convinced me that I could afford it. That's like all agents pretty much. Worst comes to worst, I sell. Well, the pre-build is ahead of schedule, so I can't afford the last of the down payment. I can't sell because the market is now insanely down. If I sell it, it will be at a big loss and I can't take the hit for it. On top of that, a change in job / salary makes me not guaranteeing the mortgage I need. So that person is completely fucked, to put it bluntly, and they're completely screwed. And you've got to remember though, let's think about it, because if the developer is going to come after the buyers here, there's going to be loads of people in these situations, and are they going to have the money to fund the legal costs for these lawsuits? Probably not, especially when they're in trouble as well because all these people aren't completing on their condos. So they're going to be in trouble. So it's going to be a really interesting dynamic. But I think all of this really falls back onto the banks, because these loans that have been created and lent into existence for these huge buildings are mostly credit, are not going to be paid back because they can't be paid back because people aren't completing on their purchases. And then all the money that was used for down payments and stuff like that will have been ate up by the initial construction costs. So it's just a total disaster is waiting in the condo market. And it's one that kind of has a lot of similarities between the 1990s and now. Not totally identical, but a lot of similarities. And of course, a lot of banks went bust on the back of that, you have to remember as well. And then the Canadian population growth continued to slow with almost no increase in Q1. So this came out, the Canadian Press, June 18th. The agency says the Canadian population rose by 20,107 people in January 1st to April 1st to 41.5 million. The smallest increase since the third quarter of 2020, when it contracted by 1,232 people. So that is very interesting because that spells trouble for, again, the condo market, for, again, the housing market. A lot of these condos were investments for renting out to people who were coming to Canada probably at a ridiculously high price. Well, guess what? Rents are reversing. The population growth has absolutely tanked compared to what it was. So now you look at the situation and you're like, yeah, this ain't gonna go well. This is not gonna go well here, and you can really see it. So that's just another thing. And then average asking rents fall annually for the 8th straight month in Canada to $2,129. And again, this is just showing you, because what has really fueled the housing market for so long is high rents and rents rising, and the rents were rising because of the population growth and the massive demand, and that just caused lots of people to invest in property. And now you basically got it all in reverse. Like, it's all in reverse. So it is a disaster for the housing market, because when you look at the fundamentals that have actually pushed it to these massive highs, they have not only stopped, but they are reversing. They're starting to go the opposite way. I mean, even if rents flatline, then people would be but rents actually going down is another thing, because you can always tell a bubble, because if it's cheaper to rent than it is to buy, then the place you're probably looking at is in a bubble. And that's exactly the case with like 99% of places in Canada. So it's very interesting. And that's been the case for a long time, guys, as we know. So anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, I'd highly recommend that you check out this video here. And then if you're looking for a VPN and want to help support this channel, use the VPN that I use. Links are in the description to ExpressVPN. That's the VPN that I use, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.